22nd, 2013. This is this Wednesday's weekly report. I'm Jason Ross, joined here in the studio by Lyndon LaRouche and Cody Jones, who I believe has some remarks to kick us off today.
Yes. So we will discuss, or at least start to discuss, the way forward for humanity. Now, we've been discussing, obviously, that we are, for anyone who's awake or alive, should recognize we are totally in the throes of a full-on global economic collapse. And as Mr. LaRouche has put forward, and as our movement has been fighting for, obviously the first immediate step is to set up the firewall through glass-steagall. But that's only the first step. We've then got to quickly go towards a Hamiltonian-style credit system through a national banking structure to fund such things as the NWAPA project, which would allow us to start to channel the flow of activity, of resources, to create the employment, to then start to build our way out of what's not just a monetary crisis, but an actual physical collapse for humanity, typified by what we're seeing with food shortages, our inability to deal with extreme weather, the water crisis, what have you. But all of those are just immediate measures to be taken to, in effect, do what you had said before, Lynn. We've got to first put the brakes on the collapse. That it's not just simply a matter of moving towards the positive growth process, but we first got to put the brakes on the collapse function and start to turn this thing around. Now, upon doing that, and in the process of getting there, it's going to be important to go back and see and pick up where humanity had fallen off from what had been a very real potential for an explosion in human creativity and an explosion in human progress. And I'm referring here to the period really which comes out of the late 1800s, early 1900s up through the mid-1900s with the work of people like Einstein, Planck, and others. Those who are part of this quantum revolution, so to speak, whose ideas and discoveries set the stage for what could be and should be the types of technologies to be employed to really move ourselves out of this current paradigm and to enable us to do what Mr. LaRouche has been talking about, which is to fully take control of, at minimum, for now, the inner solar system. But to do that is going to require, first and foremost, as a principle, moving into the next phase, the next platform of energy flux density technology usage. And so this means things like moving towards the use of high-powered lasers. This means moving towards things like high-energy plasmas, moving immediately to implement the use of nuclear power, which we should have done 50 years ago, but then using that as a platform to really move towards the development, the usable development of fusion power, and then things like matter-antimatter reactions. But what has to be understood is that to really fully exploit those technologies and to make them usable and applicable towards the kind of transformation that we're discussing when we talk about getting dominion over the entire inner region of the solar system, is going to mean going back to the quality of mind of those people who produce those discoveries. That's not going to simply be enough to just apply the technology, but if we're going to apply it appropriately, we're going to have to understand what was the quality of mind that produced those technologies and the discoveries that gave birth to them. So to get at that, I just wanted to use some quotes from people like Max Planck and others to give people a sense of what was this quality of mind, what was the kind of culture, what was the ontological perspective that these various great discoverers had that enabled them to make these next breakthroughs, in which, as I said, we're going to have to get back to that quality of mind if we're going to be able to apply those breakthroughs appropriately. Now, in your latest paper, Lynn, this A New Meaning for Space, you really make the point that we've lost sight of the idea of both life per se and creativity per se. These concepts are often, there's an attempt to reduce them down to some sort of mechanism, to build up to life from matter, or to build up to creativity as an epiphenomenon of a biological process. And that's become standard in today's scientific community and just the population at large. But this isn't the way that the real geniuses of history have thought about it. They had a completely opposite, inverted approach to the ideas of life and to creativity, to cognition. And so just use some quotes to give people a sense of that. So we'll start here. This is a quote from Louis Pasteur on life, his idea of it. So Pasteur says, "You put matter before life, and you make matter eternal. How do you know that the progress of science will not force you to affirm that life is eternal and not matter? You go from matter to life, because your present knowledge tells you that you cannot understand things in a different way. Who can assure me that in 10,000 years we will not say that it is impossible not to go from life to matter?" And then later he says, along those lines, "The universe is a dissymmetric totality. I tend to think that life, in the form we observe it, must be a function of the dissymmetry of the universe." And so you here have Pasteur, who I think people recognize was a great revolutionary in the field of biology and science, who was starting to challenge this idea that somehow you can get to life from matter, that you can build up to life. But the reality is, he saw it, as we'll see others, that life itself was a universal, that life was not something that could be reduced to some mechanism or a collection of parts, but that life expressed something universal about the nature of the universe. And he brings up this idea of dissymmetry, or I think what we can think of as something which is, it has a directionality to it. It's not a steady state thermodynamic system, but the universe is inherently directional. It's, in a sense, unstable, but unstable in a creative, directional way. And that life is an expression of that quality of the universe as a whole. Now, next person I'd like to quote here is Max Planck, who goes even further with this discussion. And if I can find that here. Oh, yes. So this is from an interview with Max Planck done in 1931. And, I mean, the whole interview is short, but there's a lot of profound ideas in it. But I'll just go with one, just to give people a sense of the way that Planck thought about this. So after some discussion about aesthetics, Planck had some very interesting things to say about the relationship between beauty and science, aesthetics and science. But then they get into the question of consciousness, of mind. And so the questioner asks Planck, he says, "Do you think that consciousness can be explained in terms of matter and its laws?" And so Planck says, "No. I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness." Then the interviewer goes on and says, "In reply to another question concerning the notorious difficulties that beset modern physics, particularly the phenomena of light, where we apparently have to use two sets of ideas, the wave-particle duality, that are in contradiction to one another, I found that Professor Planck considered that these difficulties illustrate the extent to which the world of science depends upon the mind. For he considered that these difficulties arise simply because we regard certain concepts as being objective realities. Thus we assume that everything that exists in nature exists in space and time. The material universe, we assume, is something that exists in space and time. When we regard certain modern scientific entities, as for example the light quantum, from this point of view, they seem to possess contradictory properties. Thus, certain experiments show that the light quantum is very large, and other experiments show that it is very small. Planck suggests that the light quantum is something to which the notions of spatial and temporal extension do not apply. Men must learn to regard space and time not as objective realities to which everything must conform, but as concepts which, in this region of phenomenon, must now be transcended. They are not objective realities independent of consciousness, and perhaps none such exist. And so you see, this was the quality of mind you had with someone like Max Planck, who recognized, as we've been discussing for some years now pretty profusely, that space, time, these are not ideas which we can assume are realities. And to the extent that people try to impose them as a priori realities, they fall short. They fail in the domain of science. And I think it's important to recognize that, there's plenty of things we've quoted before from Einstein to similar effect. And it's important to realize where people like Planck and Einstein came from. I mean, they were part of a very rich classical culture. I mean, we've heard stories of Planck playing with people like the Klingler Quartet, which was a quartet which was came directly out of this unbroken continuity from Brahms and the Schumann circles up to Joachim, and then Klingler comes directly out of the Joachim tradition. And this is the tradition that Planck was part of. He played with these circles. And, we've seen Einstein and what he says about the role of music and classical culture in determining the way he thought about science. And then you look at the way that these networks intersected, for example, Curler. And Curler's idea that you had to always go towards wholeness, that the mind did not understand things in terms of a collection of parts, but that the mind, its natural tendency was towards wholes, was towards unity, which is very much, again, Klingler, he comes out of the same musical tradition of people like Furtwängler at that time, which Planck and Einstein were very much attuned to, which also approached things from the standpoint of wholeness. What's the one? What's the idea which is behind these notes, so to speak? You've got a collection of notes, you've got a collection of parts, you've got a collection of things in your visual field, but it's not the parts which build up to the one. It's the one, it's the unity which organizes the parts, which is the ontological reality behind the pieces. And so you see there's this very intimate connection at this time between the rich classical cultural tradition that goes back to Mozart, Bach, and up through Brahms, Joachim, Klingler, that Planck and others were connected to, the Furtwängler tradition at that time. And then you've got this then intersected what was an emerging science of the investigation of the mind explicitly, that people like Curler were involved in, that people like one of the other co-founders of Gestalt psychology, Max Wertheimer. There's this famous interview that Wertheimer did with Einstein where he was trying to get behind and understand what was the process of discovery that led to Einstein's breakthrough on relativity. So you had at that time this coming together of classical culture, of science, and of the explicit investigation of the mind itself on the part of the Gestalt psychologist that really put us at that time in a position where we could have experienced a revolutionary leap in mankind's progress forward through the discoveries around quantum mechanics, the application of those discoveries to these new technologies like nuclear and fusion and other things. But unfortunately, we've seen what happened. That was attacked. It was largely killed. Science was degraded. The population was brainwashed. And we find ourselves here 60, 70 years later at the brink of potential collapse, potential extinction. And really the only way forward is to take those immediate emergency steps that we've discussed before with glass-steagall up through Nawapa, but then also a revival of this quality of mind, this quality of thinking, which is going to be absolutely necessary to move mankind forward.
Well, for as a matter of convenience, and I think a necessary convenience, have divided the immediate subject matters among three. Among objects as such, which are just objects, or we treat as objects. Then we have the principle of life, which applies to things including animals. But life as such does not suffice for mankind. Mankind has a creative capability which no animal species has. So the stupidity, of course, is simply saying we have to derive everything from objects, simply the interpretation of an interaction of objects. But that's not true, because life does not conform to that. And life also evolves. The demonstration in the history of living processes is that life evolves. It's in an upward thing, but it has a barrier, a limit to it. And the limit is found in mankind in what we would call noesis, the creative process. And that's where the problem, that's as far as we in knowledge go. Now, I've gone in more deeply in this recently, in this same matter. But that's the fact to fail to take that into account already killed you, because you're floundering. I mean, the idea of the object as such, all right, we've got things are satisfied, belong to the behavior of objects as such, bumping against each other and things, that sort of thing. Then you have life, all kinds of living processes which evolve in an upward direction. The overall process tends in an upward direction to a higher form. Then you get, in the case of mankind creates a universe which the animals cannot. The willful process. And then it leads higher to that. What does that mean? But when you get to that critical area of saying these three things have to be distinguished, they are not ontologically not identical. Therefore, you cannot go from one ontology to another without defining the interaction of the ontologies. And in this case, the human ontology is essentially noesis, which does not exist in the animal world. The animals evolve. That's a process. All kinds of things, life, evolve. That's a characteristic of life. But there's something that goes beyond that kind of life, is human noesis, where mankind intervenes and introduces a new rule which the animal kingdom is not capable of doing. But these are only the approximations, but you have to use these simple approximations in order to get on a clear foundation, which leads to the next thing which I'm doing on this other process. There is a noetic process, an inside to the noetic process, which goes beyond the animal range. And that's where the real fun comes. But you've got to get to this triad of structure before you can get into the higher domain. And that's what I'm fussing about. That's what's essential, is to understand what the higher form is. And this you approach simply by negation. For example, you take the case of Mars. Well, you have to do a lot of negation to deal with the Mars problem. And mankind has to find in himself secret capabilities which go beyond the simple human development, noesis. There are higher forms, and the fun part of the whole space program is to get pushing at the door, like trying to get inside the door of what lies beyond simple noesis. And that's what we should be pushing. And when people think that way, and they push that way, and they find examples that fit that way and go into ecstatic states of joy at these discoveries, that's mankind. And that's what's lacking. It's all this simplistically, mechanistic interpretation of everything. Mm-hmm. They have a simple deductive approach to everything. And deduction is destruction.
Especially when you throw in practicality on top.
Oh, that's terrible. That's dirty. No, but this is it. So I think from a standpoint of a simple discussion, without going into the higher realm, the first thing we have to do is we have objects which we define as objects, which are not living. We don't attribute a characteristic of life, which for us does not normally exist in terms of any objects we throw around. We take certain forms of activity, we call that life. It is a unique quality. And then you have a higher form, which is mankind. Now the animals evolve, plants evolve. They evolve in that sense. So there's a change process. Mm-hmm. And the change process is from non-life to life. But that's not satisfactory. You have to get to the next phase. You have to go from life, to the human mind, which is a noetic process, which does not exist simply among the animals. The animals can learn, like the puppies can learn.
Mm-hmm.
They learn.
Right.
They come to you, however, for the learning. And if you don't do something that helps them learn something better, they become very angry creatures. They're frustrated and angry creatures. They can't solve these problems. Human beings give them toys to play with and show them how to use the toys. The puppies are therefore happy because you're giving them something which is out instead of being bestial in their attitude. But mankind is different. And mankind becomes bestialized when he doesn't go forward and doesn't go to higher states of things. Why do we do it? We do it because it's there. All principles of creativity are based. Why is it done? It's done because it's there, and it would be terrible not to do it.
Mm-hmm. All right, well, thanks for joining us. That'll do it for this week. See you next time.
All right.